But yeah, thank you for being here. So like she said, my presentation is called Across the Atlantic, and it's going to be a ceramic comparison between Saint-Pierre, Miquelon and Martinique. I have two sites, sorry, as I'm getting my notes out. I have two sites that I've been comparing for my master's work through Memorial University under the guidance of Catherine Lozier, who also presented on Saint-Pierre, Miquelon earlier today, which I hope you did see. But to begin with, the trade network of the early 18th and 19th century is kind of more what I'm focused on, and specifically reconstructing this period because it's not well known due to the fall of Nouvelle-France at the time, and kind of the shift of the French economic focus down to the south where the Caribbean sugar was more profitable. But that doesn't discount Saint-Pierre's importance in the north as they provided much of the cod needed to feed the colonies and to feed the French mainland as well. So by kind of focusing on reconstructing these trade routes, I was able to kind of compare the two poles of the French Atlantic, which in this case are Saint-Pierre, who was the administrative center of the north, and Martinique, who was the administrative center of the south and the Caribbean. And unfortunately, these networks were unreliable, and that is mainly because the French crown had issues with getting just enough to feed all of their colonies, had issues with the distance between the colonies. There was conflict and war constantly disrupting their trade networks, and frankly, in the South, there was a significant amount of racism towards the enslaved individuals that were forced from their home, and consequently ended up having to mainly provision themselves because these networks were so unreliable to all that unfortunately had to rely on them. And edicts as well were passed to try and enforce more kind of French nationalism, which unfortunately did not work out well for these individuals who found themselves in the colonies overseas. So the islands of Saint-Pierre Miquelon, if you are unaware, are right off the coast of Newfoundland, about 25 kilometers, and were frequented by Breton, Norman, Basque, and Portuguese fishermen, transatlantic fishermen for the most part. There were obviously other individuals, and there were indigenous individuals who used the islands beforehand as well. But the waters surrounding these islands were largely exploited through the 17th and 18th century, where you had that cod boom that everyone was kind of scrambling for and trying to get their economic profits in on. So you had fishermen crossing seasonally and tending to reoccupy these sites along the shorelines, which is where Anse-Bertrand, which is the study site in question in Saint-Pierre, is found. So you have a seasonally reoccupied site. It could be the same fishing crews year after year. It could be different fishing crews. They could be Breton, Norman, Basque, or Portuguese, depending on the years that they decide to re-inhabit these areas. And unfortunately, it has led to a lot of destruction of the context and a lot of kind of mixing of the context. Conflict at the time as well made it very difficult to keep discrete context. So you would have raising of the islands in between these occupations, or sometimes you would have seasons where there would be no fishermen on the shoreline. So all that to say, it gets very difficult when you're trying to excavate some of these areas just because of the nature of the occupations. So the site itself of Anse-Bertrand is located just outside the main harbor of Saint-Pierre, and hadn't been occupied from the 1680s onwards. And in this picture, kind of below on the left, you'll see that there is still a house standing there that is also still seasonally occupied. The site was dug by Mun Archaeology Field School from 2017 to 2019, and it will be subject to another field school excavation this coming summer as well. But my studies kind of stick to that 2017 to 2019 time period. So the main aspect of this collection that jumps out at you is just the sheer number of ceramics from France, as opposed to all of the other ones. And unfortunately, there is a higher amount of indeterminate just because of that destructive nature of the fishery. There are some fragments which are so badly damaged and so small, they're very difficult to identify. But for the most part, most of these ceramics are originating from France, which, when taken into context, how unreliable this French network was and how little access these fishermen could potentially have to it, it kind of begs the question, where are they getting all of these French products? And up here on the right, you'll see a nice little cross section of some of the nicer 18th century objects that we did have, and were able to put together and put in a display for the museum there. So if you're ever in Saint-Pierre, you can go see that. So the collection of Anse Bertrand is mainly associated with the Normandy stoneware of Domfront and Bessin-Contentin, which is from the Normandy region in France. The Pabu, Guingamp, and Saint-Jean de la Poterie, coarse earthenwares of the Brittany region, and La Chapelle des Pots, which is the area where Saintonge was mainly manufactured. So you have this Normandy stoneware in such high quantities in Saint-Pierre, and it's very, Peter Pope has noted in some of his previous work that the Normandy stoneware is very signatory of the fishery itself. And then you also have these Bretonwares that are strongly associated with, well, have become associated with the fisheries, mainly due to Pope's work in the Petit Nord. And these wares would have mainly been used to transport goods, such as, in the case of the Normandy stonewares, goods such as dairy products like butter, which was very important and a very big French dietary staple, and salted meats. And then in the Bretonwares, you would have salt and other salted meats as well, but not necessarily dairy products all the time. But all of these storage pots, for lack of a better term, would then be brought across the Atlantic and reused time and time again over the site, get turned into cooking pots or other storage vessels for other liquids throughout the season, just kind of making use of whatever they could. So based on this kind of assemblage, mainly coming from that southwestern area of France, it can be safely assumed that the fishermen were likely originating from this Normandy Brittany area, and bringing these goods with them from home so that they could simply bypass that unreliable network, or just not need to interact with something that maybe they wouldn't have to throughout the fishing season. So they ended up kind of turning in on themselves to rely on their own provisioning rather than the provisioning of the French crown. So going back down south now, you have Crèvecoeur, which is a average sized, about 500 acres, Martinican sugar plantation in the southwestern commune of Sainte-Anne, sorry. And it kind of first appeared on a map around 1770, but it was thought to be established before then, and kept on as a sugar plantation until just after abolition in about 1848. So this plantation would have housed around 100 to 200 enslaved individuals at any given time. And here, circled in red, you are able to see the enslaved community housing that was on the plantation. And that is one of the areas that Ken Kelly did excavate when he excavated there between 2005 and 2010. And Ken was kind enough to give me permission to reanalyze this collection in 2019 to determine, just to use it as for comparison purposes, so that we could kind of determine how those different provisioning strategies happened in the North Atlantic versus the South Atlantic or the Caribbean. So Ken's work was so separated into locuses, and due to time constraints, I focused on 4 loci. So C, E, F, and M were kind of what I was hoping to encompass, because they are a good cross-section of the entire site itself, and you get all of the different elements within those, and you cover that entire time period of 1763 to 1815 that I'm more concerned with. So the study right away shows that over half, 55%, of the material culture or the ceramics found within these sites were of local origin. So it's a coarse earthenware, low-fired coarse earthenware, very porous, known as coconeg, and it's everywhere in Martinique, and it's mainly associated with cooking. Same with the imported wares; those were also mainly associated with cooking within the context that the enslaved individuals found themselves in. So France, they imported most of their other ceramics from France, and very little variety elsewhere was seen on the plantation. So the most prevalent wares were that French imported Valoris, and then the locally made coconeg. So Valoris, you can see it on the left, and the coconeg on the right. They're both cooking pots, and both in the collection show evidence of heat altering, and so they were used for their purposes. The overall distribution of Valoris within the context of an infirmary and in the enslaved community housing area does show that maybe that glazing on the inside was useful in those contexts where the coconeg was more porous, so maybe not as suitable for certain activities or purposes or what have you. So one of the largest things that you can see here is that it was mostly cooking being done on this site. Very little storage was being needed because, unfortunately, these enslaved individuals were frequently faced with famine and starvation. So storage wasn't an issue, as their food supplies were never in great enough quantities to require too much storage. So by using these cooking pots, you could cook and strategically where you could extend rations and extend the foraged food that they would be eating, and allowed kind of a really economic way of providing for themselves, as the French crown very rarely did provide enough rations and very rarely did provide enough materials needed to survive on these plantations, and needed that they would need to also provide for, unfortunately, their enslavers as well. So they were having to kind of turn inwards and use that locally made ceramic. It's strongly associated with ceramics that are made in Africa as well. So it's assumed a cultural tradition kind of passed down and adapted to more of the island culture, and then kind of used to as much of an advantage as they could, so that they would be able to provide for themselves where that crown kind of failed them among many ways. So all of this to say that where the French crown kind of lacked, and where the sorry, actually, hang on, I missed a point there. And all that to say that where the kind of French crown lacked, they did have a collection of Valoris cooking pots that were kind of more anchored in that Mediterranean basin. So you do see that different anchoring points within France on where they're providing. Kind of that southwestern coast was mostly provisioning Saint-Pierre, Miquelon, and then you have the Mediterranean, which was providing for the Caribbean and the French Antilles. So the cultural resilience through necessity is kind of a point that I do like to stress in some of this work, where the individuals who were laboring for the French crown, either forced or not forced, unfortunately did end up having to provide for themselves most of the time, as they were failed by the crown that they were laboring for, and ended up turning inwards to kind of form a stronger cultural bond within themselves so that they were able to provide with them for themselves. In the context of Saint-Pierre, you have these fishermen who, rather than relying on a provision network that had been historically unreliable, they ended up bringing their goods over themselves. And then you have the enslaved individuals in Martinique who were not able to rely on any provisioning from the French crown. And so we're able to kind of culturally adapt and allow that culture to survive throughout the ages of allowing them to survive by using these traditions that they were able to pass down so that they could kind of remake and fill in the gaps that were left by their enslavers. So the material culture really speaks to kind of each island's individual cultural identity and how it was able to flourish under the constraints that the French crown placed them on. And this is all it's very quick, and it's very much of a light touch on the subject. But if you are interested in more, there should be a book coming out very soon that dives a little bit more into the Martinican side of things. And there should be an article also out very soon that kind of speaks towards this comparison of the different material cultures of Saint-Pierre and Martinique. And now that my shameless plug is done, thank you very much. Merci à tous. And are there any questions?